What would you do if the woman waiting at home was quietly trying to save your future one 10,000 dong packet at a time, while the man who had once saved your entire life was preparing to disappear into a small garden and ask for nothing in return? Jack did not know any of that when he stepped onto the land with Mr. Dung. To anyone else, it looked like a simple visit. Two men standing in an open space, looking over a modest piece of land bordered by uneven soil, a low fence, and the outline of a future too quiet to impress the world. But to Jack, this was not just land, it was the shape of a decision. The kind of decision that comes after a person has already given away more than anyone had the right to ask. And the hardest part was this: Jack still did not know how to repay him. Because the man standing beside him was not a broker, not a business partner, not someone chasing profit. Mr. Dung was the man who had once emptied his own life to keep Jack's from collapsing. And now, after saving him, he wanted almost nothing back. No share, no title, no grand thanks, just a quiet patch of earth where the rest of his life could finally breathe. Jack looked across the land, then at Mr. Dung's face, and one question kept rising inside him. How do you stand in front of a kindness that can never be measured? At that same hour, far from that open field, Tu Tien stood in a kitchen that felt smaller than usual because of everything she could not say. Morning had arrived hard and hot. Sunlight did not enter the room softly. It pushed through the gaps in the door and spread across the floor in sharp lines, making the air feel heavy before the day had even properly begun. But the heat was not what made Tu Tien restless. It was Jack's silence. The bank debt was no longer some distant fear they could postpone with hope and patience. It was drawing closer, day by day, tightening around him even when he tried to speak calmly. Even when he smiled and said everything was still manageable. Tu Tien never believed those words completely. Not because she doubted him, because she knew him too well. She knew the difference between a man who was calm and a man who was trying not to let the people he loved feel his panic. She saw it in the way Jack's eyes stayed open long after midnight. In the pauses before he answered simple questions. In the quiet exhaustion he carried into the morning like a second shadow. She did not press him. That was her love too. She understood that there are moments when asking too much does not create closeness. It creates another burden. So instead of forcing him to say what he was still trying to hold together inside himself, she chose something else. She chose action. Not the kind that solves everything in one dramatic sweep. The kind that enters a hard life, quietly and still changes it. She tied her hair back, cleared the table, and began preparing bonduk. It was not an expensive dish, not a dish anyone would call impressive, but to Tu Tien, it was a way to stand beside Jack without waiting helplessly for life to become kinder. If she could sell enough small portions, maybe it would not erase the debt. Maybe it would not rescue them, but it would say something important. You are not carrying this alone. She prepared the ingredients carefully, almost reverently. Every motion was familiar, but today each one carried more meaning. Washing, cutting, mixing, wrapping, arranging. She did not rush. She did not allow carelessness. It felt as though she were pressing more than labor into the food. She was pressing hope into it. Discipline, refusal, the belief that if two people keep moving, even slowly, despair does not get to name the ending. Then, just before leaving, she remembered something else. Jack had barely been sleeping. That truth hurt her in a different way because it was not loud enough to call attention to itself. He did not complain, he did not speak of his fatigue like a victim, but she saw the erosion anyway, the kind that happens quietly, thought after thought, pressure after pressure, night after night without full rest, a body still working, a mind refusing to shut down. So before going to the market, Tu Tien changed direction and stopped to buy pork heart and mugwort. simple ingredients, ordinary, easy for others to overlook. But she knew what they could become: a warm dish to help him sleep, a small act of care placed exactly where his body was beginning to fail him. Not a cure, not a miracle, just love arriving in the right form at the right moment. And that is where the real strength of Tu Tien lived. Not in speeches, not in tears, not in dramatic sacrifice performed so the world could admire her. Her strength lived in the unnoticed choices that kept life moving when life wanted to freeze. In the bowl prepared before sunrise, in the quiet trip to the market, in the way she paid attention to what Jack needed even when Jack himself refused to ask. Meanwhile, Jack and Mr. Dung were still walking the land. There was no city noise here, no urgent phone calls, no meetings, no business language sharp enough to cut through the skin. Only open air, turned soil, and the possibility of a slower life. Mr. Dung stood with his hands behind his back and looked across the field without saying much. He did not need to. The place itself spoke for him. It was modest, almost plain, but that was exactly the point. This was not land chosen for status. It was land chosen for peace. Jack kept listening, but inside him, another story was unfolding, because this moment was not only about what Mr. Dung wanted now. It was about everything he had already done before this day ever arrived. There had been a time when Jack's life was very close to breaking apart completely. The company had become unstable. Pressure pressed in from every side. Debt piled higher. Each decision threatened to become the one that would finish everything. It was the kind of season that strips a man down to fear, pride, exhaustion, and the unbearable knowledge that failure would not destroy only him. And in that moment, when most people would have stepped back to protect themselves, Mr. Dung stepped forward, quietly, without spectacle, without demanding recognition. He did something very few people would do. He stopped building his own future so Jack's could remain standing. He put aside the business he had spent years creating. He gave up the security he had earned over a long stretch of labor, and little by little, then all at once, he poured his savings into Jack's crisis. Not a token amount, not a safe amount, everything he had, enough to pay debts, enough to stop the company from being swept away immediately, enough to give Jack time to breathe, to repair, to stand again. The money itself mattered, yes, but what mattered even more was what the money represented. Years of sacrifice, years of careful accumulation, years that could not be given back once spent. And yet Mr. Dung never treated it like a wound. He gave it because he believed Jack deserved another chance. That belief stayed with Jack more heavily than any debt notice ever had. Over time, the worst of the storm did pass. Not in a magical way, not because life became easy, but the edge of collapse receded. Work stabilized enough for breathing room to return. The world stopped ending every morning. And when that happened, Mr. Dung made another decision that surprised almost everyone except the people who truly understood him. He chose not to return. Not to business, not to rivalry, not to the world of pressure and endless calculation. He chose to step away from all of it and live simply. A garden, a modest house, a place where days could move slowly and no one would demand pieces of his soul in exchange for survival. Jack respected that choice. But respect was not the same thing as ease, because the more he understood it, the more deeply he felt the weight of gratitude. Some kindness cannot be repaid in money because it was never only money. It was time, trust, sacrifice, faith. It was someone saying, when your life was worth doubting, I will still believe in you. That kind of debt does not disappear. It becomes part of a man's character, part of how he lives from then on. By evening, Jack returned home, still carrying all of that inside him. The door opened, the familiar room appeared. The small kitchen was still lit by a gentle yellow light. Nothing inside the house had become luxurious. Nothing had changed outwardly enough to impress anyone. but the room felt warm in the precise way a tired man notices immediately. Tu Tien was there, not rushing, not asking him questions before he had even put his things down, just standing by the stove near the still warm dishes she had prepared, the porridge with mugwort, the food she had made to sell, the ordinary meal waiting for him. In that instant, Jack felt the difference between a place and a refuge. They sat down together. The conversation did not begin dramatically. That was what made it real. They spoke in the low, steady way people do after a long day, when both are tired enough to value truth more than performance. Jack told her about the land, about the silence there, about how Mr. Dung looked while standing in that open space, as if he had finally stepped far enough away from old pressure to hear himself think again. Then he spoke about what he could not shake, not the land itself, the man, the fact that after everything he had given, Mr. Dung still wanted so little for himself. No return to power, no attempt to recover lost status. Just peace. Jack's voice stayed steady, but Tu Tien heard the weight beneath it. This was not just a story from the day. It was memory, responsibility, gratitude pressing against the limits of language. She did not interrupt. She did not need to fill the silence with advice. She listened with the kind of attention that tells a man he is safe enough to say the things he cannot arrange anywhere else. And because she understood what Mr. Dung meant to Jack, she also understood that this was not a debt he would ever stop feeling. Some debts should not be erased. They should be honored. That night, nothing was solved completely. The bank was still there. The pressure was still real. The future was still uncertain. But something inside the room held. The next morning, Tu Tien took the bonduk to the market. Each packet cost only 10,000 dong, a tiny price. The kind of number people barely notice when spending. But to Tu Tien, each one represented hours of work, discipline, and quiet courage. At first, she was shy. Her invitations came out softly. Her smile looked a little uncertain. Every customer required a small act of bravery. But she kept going. One person stopped, then another. One packet sold, then another. Gradually, the fear loosened. Her voice grew more natural. Her smile turned genuine. Confidence did not arrive all at once, but it came, slowly, clearly, honestly. And beside her, Jack remained there in the way that mattered most. Not taking over, not making her smaller by trying to save her effort. Just staying near, present, supportive, letting her do it, while making sure she never had to feel alone doing it. By late in the day, the basket was empty. Tu Tien looked down at it and smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. It was not a huge success story. It was something better. It was proof that movement was still possible, proof that effort still mattered, proof that even now, even here, life could still respond to care. And that is the emotional core this script should protect. Not just difficulty, not just sacrifice, not just gratitude explained in abstract terms, but visible love through action. A woman quietly helping the man she loves survive. A man carrying a debt of human kindness he can never fully repay. Another man walking away from the world after giving everything, not because he lost, but because peace had become more valuable than winning. That is where the real power of the story lives. If you want this script to perform better for retention, the key is exactly this structure. Open with the emotional conflict already burning. Delay the full explanation. Reveal Mr. Dung's sacrifice in stages. Cross-cut Jack's gratitude with Tu Tien's quiet effort. End each mini-section with a new emotional question, and make sure every scene proves love through behavior, not explanation.